So in the Tanya book, we're on page 30. That's referring to the page numbers at the bottom of the page. And we are 6 lines down, the third last word on the line. It's actually 5 lines down, the third last word on the line. I'm going to put it on the screen as well so you can see it. Let's just get, oops, we were in the right place. There we go. Okay, actually we were not in the right place. A little bit further back. No, we were in the right place. Masha Enken. Okay, there we go. So if you are looking in the Tanya book, like I say, it's page 30, it's the 5th line on the page, and it is the third last word on the line, ma. And if you are looking on the screen, it is the 4th line on the page, and again, it is the second last word on the line. Okay, so the context of this chapter so far is that we have introduced ourselves to a principle called Klipas Noiga, which basically means that the vast majority of things that exist in our world are things that have a neutral spiritual value, and we can then assign a value to these items or to these things or to these experiences or to these concepts depending on how we engage with them. So we spent quite a lot of time talking about them, and we said that effectively, let's say, for example, kosher food, because that's obviously the most popular example. Everybody likes anything that's got to do with food. So if a person has kosher food, it is not automatically, naturally associated with some deep, holy, spiritual experience. It's food. It might be kosher, but it's still just food. And if we want to get the real value out of it, then what we've got to do is we've got to approach that food with a higher intention. So we're going to say a bracha before we eat the food, and then at the time that we do eat the food, we're going to have a high intention, which is to absorb the nutrients so that we'll have the energy to be able to do more of what Hashem wants. And in that way, we'll transform this food from being just mundane and ordinary, and it will become something which is holy. And we gave various other examples. We said the same applies to the intimate relations between husband and wife, the same applies to business, etc. So that was the concept of Klipas Noiga. That's, so to speak, the klippa that has potential. But this evening we're going to talk a little bit more about the dark side. Some people get very excited when they hear that we're going to talk about the dark side. Some people think that there's a certain intrigue about the more murky, darker parts of life. And the reality, it's unfortunately not as exciting, I should say, as it appears. You know, the dark side is dark. That's how it is. So what we're going to effectively talk about from here until the end of the chapter, and then it will spill over in a slightly different format into the next chapter, is things that are the incurable klippas. So that's where it's really negative energy to the extent that there's no way to rehabilitate it. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. So that's why we start off this expression we start off the section with the expression Mashain Kain, which is not the case. Mashain Kain is not the case in the following examples. Just want to point out, for the benefit of those people who are here in the human form, that just because there happens to be a Zoom as well doesn't mean you're not allowed to talk, participate, ask questions, make comments, and so on and so forth. Right? So just putting it out there, you know. Okay. So Masha Ein Kain. So what we're going to do is we're now going to contrast, as I say, the so-called dark side of things. For those people who are familiar, they use an expression sometimes in psychology where they talk about the dark triad, which is basically 3 kinds of personalities that are very difficult to deal with, and they need major intervention, and sometimes perhaps are not even rehabilitatable. So in the same way, we have the Shalosh Klipas HaTmeos. We have 3 dimensions of existence that are so completely corrupted that there's really nothing you can do to find value in them, to rehabilitate them, to elevate them. They're just completely stuck in the world of darkness. So that's what we're going to be speaking about this evening, is absolute Klippa in the world of darkness. So where do we start? Well, we started our conversation around Klipas Noiga with food. So that's where we're going to go for our conversation around the impervious clippers. We're going to also start with food. Why not? Everybody's happy to talk about food. Where was I recently? I can't remember where it was. People were, it might have been at a simcha or something, and people were standing at the buffet. I think that might have been where it was. I'm trying to place exactly where it was. And standing at the buffet, and what were they talking about? The next simcha, and what the food's going to be like at the next simcha. It's like such a Jewish thing to do, you know. Just enjoy what you have right now. No, we're already talking, anticipating. You know, I kind of get it that when people are fasting, then they want to talk about food. Fine. But when a person's feasting and you're talking about other food, that's already another level altogether. So seeing as food is very much a part of our experience, and it's a very big deal of, in our lives, so let's talk about non-kosher food. Okay, so mashe'ein kain v'ma'acholois asuros. So the exact opposite would apply when you're dealing with ma'acholois asuros, which means food that is completely prohibited. Okay, ma'acholois asuros. Okay, and while we're about it, the second example that he uses is bi'ois asuros, or a relationship that is forbidden. Okay. So what's the nature of non-kosher food, and what is the nature of a non-kosher relationship? Shehein misholosh klipos atmeos. These are things that live in that dark triad, as they call it. That really difficult part of the world where things are locked up in the world of impurity. So let's talk about non-kosher food for a second. Okay, what happens if a person decides that they're going to have a cheeseburger? So obviously, we're not here to judge anybody having a cheeseburger. Should they say a bracha?
No.
Right? Of course not. Don't say, how do you drag Hashem down into a cheeseburger? I mean, obviously, there's godly energy that makes every single thing exist, and that includes the cheeseburger as well. But it's a chutzpah. It's like a slap in the face. You're going to invoke Hashem's name at the time that you're engaging with something which is contrary to what he wants. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You don't do that. You don't do that. I mean, I hate to use a crass example, but that would effectively be the equivalent of the guy who's having an affair calling his wife to say, listen, I just want to tell you how much I love you, while he's in the other place. You know what I mean? It's like, you just don't do that. You just don't sit there in McDonald's saying, Baruch Atah Hashem, just doesn't work. Doesn't add up. But now we're going to take that a little deeper. So we've already discussed that if a person is eating a meal and the food is kosher, but they don't have any of this developed, profound insight that we're supposed to have, they don't have this high intention, they're not eating in a mindful way, they're just stuffing their face. I don't know if you've ever encountered this at a Jewish function. Never seen it, right? Never seen it. All right. It's very intriguing, when you go to enough Jewish functions, that eventually when you go to a non-Jewish function, you think, is there some kind of a shortage? What happened over here? But Kanai Noras, who say, we know how to pile it on. So we've already said that if a person eats kosher food, but in a gluttonous way, that will drag them down spiritually. And you can't just say, because the product is kosher, whatever I do and however I engage with it is automatically acceptable. Nonsense. If the product is kosher, that just means there's opportunity. There's no guarantee that you're going to use that opportunity. And if a person does not use that opportunity, then it sucks them down. So we did, though, and this is kind of where we left off last time, we said, however, 5 minutes later, half an hour later, the person could say, you know what, I shouldn't have eaten like that. I really overdid it. I really ate too much. But now that I've done it, I'm going to use the energy from that food for something meaningful. Now I'm going to go sit down and learn. Now I'm going to sit down and daven. Now I'm going to engage in a mitzvah that's going to help somebody else. I just ate myself like who knows what at the buffet. So you know what, I'm going to fulfill the mitzvah now of making the chosin and kala happy, and I'm going to get onto the dance floor. It's not always advisable straight after overeating to get onto the dance floor, but that's just from a practical perspective. So I'm going to go so what do we say? Now you're pivoting. Now you've changed your view and you've changed your approach to the food that is inside your system. Well, the good news is that food is mutar, which means it never got anchored to the darkness just because it was a dark experience. It's free. That food is free to move and to elevate. So now that you're davening with the nutrition of that food, now that you're learning Torah with the nutrition of that food, now that you're doing a mitzvah with the energy from that food, the food comes along for the ride. It becomes part of the Torah or the davening or the mitzvah. Now, can we apply the same logic to the person who goes to the local KFC, has themselves whatever it is that they serve at a KFC? Not that I would know these things, right? So whatever it is that they serve at a KFC, and then the person says, I know I shouldn't have done that, but now I'm going to go to shul. Couldn't go to shul before, I was hungry. But now I've had the KFC, it's in my system, I've got to go to shul, and I'm going to daven with the energy of that chicken. So we're not going to disqualify the davening, obviously. We're not going to say, that's it, you're tainted, and everything that you do until that has worked its way out of your system is all tainted. We're not going to say that. Your davening is davening. But does the KFC chicken join the experience of davening? Can the KFC chicken be elevated and become something of a spiritual nature because it is fueling a person who's praying? No. No. Why? Because that is asur. Now everybody translates the word asur as forbidden, but we've already learned that asur means it is tied, it is bound, it is anchored. It cannot escape the darkness, no matter what you do with it. It cannot escape the darkness. So that's the massive contrast between klipas noiga, the vast majority of things in our lives that are permissible according to Torah, but we now have the challenge of giving them real meaning, versus something which is prohibited by the Torah that has no option of redemption. You can't schlep it out of the darkness. Another example. So one of the things that we said is that an important principle of Jewish relationships is that a couple who's married, that means that their relationship is kosher. It does not mean that their relationship will be holy. It's exactly like the food. The food is kosher. It means that the food has now been authorized or has been empowered with the potential to turn into something holy. Is it automatically holy? No. How do we know that? Because we see how people behave around food and we see it's not holy. Same thing with marriage. So a couple stands under the chuppah and they perform a ritual. What do we call the ritual that they perform under the chuppah? We call it kiddushin. Kiddushin comes from the word holy. It is intended to facilitate a holy, what do they call it? Holy matrimony. Yes? It's not a Jewish expression there, but holy matrimony, right? The holy union, that's what it's designed to facilitate. It opens a portal to allow this couple to have holy experiences that they will never be able to have with anybody else. Does that mean that everything that goes on in marriage is holy? Not at all. People could be completely debased in their marital life. And especially there are certain areas of marital life that are more predisposed to debased behavior, especially in the society in which we live. Because, we live in the society today, people don't realize this, but 100 years ago, in our societies, there were certain things that were so private and so intimate that you never thought in a million years to share it in a public forum. In today's world, the more you share, the more they celebrate you. So the concept of intimacy has been largely wrecked by modern society. What's intimacy? Let it all hang out, everything. So, because that's the prevailing nature of society, it invades the intimate space as well. And the craziest part of that is that because there's this generational evolution, we are already out of touch with the extent to which the invasion on intimacy has affected our kids. Because it's this generational evolution. So even things that we would have taken for granted, the next generation turns out and says, you prudes, you're meshuggah, you're so backward, you're so conservative. Get with the program. We live in a liberated society. So because of that liberated society, all kinds of things can creep into the personal space between a husband and wife. Now, as far as Judaism is concerned, the personal space between husband and wife, particularly the physically intimate moments of their relationship, those are potentially holy moments. That's how a Jew's headspace is supposed to be. That's our perspective. The fact that you close yourself off from the rest of the world and experience an engagement that is so intimate, that is so close, is to facilitate a bond between two souls and a bond between those souls and God. That's the motivation. Unfortunately, the reality is that many, many, many times when couples experience intimacy together, it's following, or it's informed by the script of things that they may have seen in a movie, read in a novel, seen in a glossy magazine, or whatever the case is, and it's robbed of that holiness. It's been translated just into a pleasure experience, and the greater the pleasure, the better the experience. Now, that's not to say, God forbid, that Judaism has a problem with a couple experiencing pleasure in their intimacy. It's just to say that that's not the focus. That's a benefit. The focus is that you're creating this meaningful bond between you. So what happens if a person doesn't do it? What happens if a person with their own spouse has a purely hedonistic, physical experience of intimacy? Was it going to trafe up their marriage? No. It just means that instead of using a very powerful experience, a very powerful human experience as a portal for elevation, they've allowed it just to be sucked down into the normality of our world, the mundanity of our world. But there's no, so to speak, locking yourself into something dark. But bi'os asuros, what happens if a person engages in a relationship that is forbidden? There's no redemption. Right? It's like the non-kosher food. You can daven as much as you want after the fact. It's not going to translate that energy or that nutrition into something meaningful. The same way, after the fact, a person could do all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, it's not going to translate that forbidden relationship to now suddenly become a holy relationship. It can't. It's forbidden. It is kosher. It is osur. It is stuck. And that's what he's going to tell us, literally, in the next words. These are things that are powered by this very dark reality, these three dimensions of Klippa. Those experiences and the part of ourselves that was involved in those experiences, that's completely locked into darkness forever. That's a big word. Le'olam. Forever. There is no rehabilitation. There's no escape. It's a big concept, right? Nu, you should have a question at this point.
I actually have a question. Just a bit confused as far as the food goes. So a person who's, let's say, Baal Shuvah and he goes to shul and he's not eating kosher and he goes to shul, does that affect his davening? I mean.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question just for those that couldn't necessarily hear. So if you have somebody who's on the path and they're not necessarily at the point that they're observing everything, so they're still eating non-kosher food, and then they come to shul and they daven. So your question is, does the non-kosher food, because that's the energy they're running on when they daven, does that contaminate or diminish the impact of their davening? And the answer is it can't contaminate. The impure food inside the human system cannot contaminate the davening, which is not inside the human system. But what it cannot do either is it cannot become part of the davening. So you got a person who's effectively in a spiritual tug of war, because here the person is davening, which means there's a part of themselves that's edging upwards and looking to transcend, and simultaneously there's like this lead in their stomach that's just dragging them down at the same time. So it creates this tension and the struggle in terms of where am I actually going to go. The davening is fine. I can't contaminate the davening, the mitzvah, the Torah learning. But the question is, where am I? So you're effectively saying, here's a person who's going to latch on to this powerful spiritual helium balloon while they're wearing a weight belt. So it becomes a very difficult dynamic. I'll put it into different words. There's a very disturbing expression that is used in Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is not philosophy. Shulchan Aruch is not mysticism. Shulchan Aruch is basic Jewish law. And one of the things that it speaks about over there is that there are certain things that we're not allowed to eat or certain things that we're not allowed to drink. And there's the possibility of these things being metamteim halev v'hamoyach, which means that they create a desensitization of the mind and of the heart. So that means that a person could, for example, daven. We'll use that as an example, where the objective of davening is obviously to have a meaningful feeling and experience of connection to Hashem. And while they're davening, it's not having that kind of impact, because the in the same way as we talk about thickening of the arteries, from eating cholesterol-based foods, so there's a thickening of the soul's arteries when a person eats non-kosher food. So it becomes desensitized. That's why there's this tug of war. There's a part of me that's trying to elevate because I'm in an experience of holiness, davening, learning, doing a mitzvah. And then there's a part of me that says, but we can't elevate right now because we're being bogged down by the stuff that's clogging up the spiritual arteries. So no, your davening can't be contaminated by the non-kosher food, but your experience of what davening should achieve can. Make sense? Okay? So what's the question? You should have a question. There's one word in this sentence that is an incredibly disturbing word, and that should fly in the face of everything that we believe as Jewish people. Exactly. Forever? Are we proposing that something negative could have eternal negativity? Let's put it differently. If you want to say that there's something that Hashem has designated to be unholy or impure, so let's say, for argument's sake, I don't know, I'm going to dafka deliberately avoid the ultimate example of a non-kosher food, and we'll use the next level down, okay? So let's say a lobster, yes? I think it's fair for anybody to acknowledge that lobster has been designated as a non-kosher food for eternity. That's it, there's nothing you can do. You can never release lobsters from impurity. Right? It doesn't appeal. Okay, so we're lucky. We're lucky that it doesn't appeal. Some people might tell us, listen, you don't know what you're missing. Because some years ago, there was a fellow who was living in this country, he was not from this country, and he was getting married. So he approached, you were there, I think. So he approached me to do the wedding. And we got together, and we had a whole pre-wedding meeting and the whole thing. And he said, so I said to him, where's the wedding going to be? That's going to be in his house in Bryanston. Do you remember this? And I'm sure you were there. And who's catering? That's a key question. No, he's got this guy who's a chef, top chef. And he's the chef at that time, it was at the Santon Sun, I think it was. And he's going to do the whole meal. I'm like, whoa, not so fast, buddy. If you want the rabbi to do the wedding, the meal has to be kosher. Nothing to discuss. Anyhow, it was a massive thing for him. Why? Because he had to have lobster on the menu. So there you go. It was a massive thing. So eventually what we said is, have a nice life. If you want a chuppah, we'll happily come over and bring a minyan and do a chuppah, and we'll have a meal. We'll bring a meal. So I took guys from the shul. We went there, we did a chuppah, we davened mincha over there, we had a meal, and about a week later, he had his lobster with all his friends.
And you see the opposite. You see non-halachic weddings, if that's the right term.
Yeah.
But kosher catering, because one of either the groom or the bride is kosher.
Yeah.
He's Jewish.
He's Jewish.
You see that?
Correct. Exactly. So the wedding is not even a kosher wedding, and the food is kosher. Exactly. So the point over here is, we understand if you say that an item has been designated as eternally non-kosher or eternally impure, because that's the way God designed the world, that's fine. But you can tell me that me and my experience gets locked into something le'olam forever? Forever? So what does that mean? Does that mean that if a person, let's use a really radical example, a person grows up completely oblivious to the fact that Jews are not supposed to eat shellfish. Never went to a Jewish school, never grew up in a Jewish community, had zero education. Are you telling me that that person has now got a component of themselves that is locked away forever in the world of shellfish?
I might have to leave the room.
Is that what he's saying? Lo'olam, forever? Can't be forever.
Question
Sorry, you're breaking up terribly.
from the Zoom team.
Yeah. No, just you were breaking up terribly, so
Sorry.
you're okay now.
What about if you're a convert? Still,
Okay?
am I still breaking up?
No, you're good. You're good.
What about if you're a convert and you ate lobster in the days before you converted? What happens to that?
That's a good question, right? Because we'd have to determine would have to determine if a Jewish person who is ignorant is in the same category as a person who did not grow up Jewish and converted later. It's a really interesting question. So hold that thought and let's see what the Alter Rebbe says. Because look what the Alter Rebbe says. This is so Jewish. Forever, which is a very, I think, a very clear word, right? A very unequivocal word. Forever until. Look, that's what he does. Forever until. Hang on a second. Maybe forever until. So, by the way, the Torah does the exact same thing. The Torah tells us that there's a principle of forever when it comes to owning land in the land of Israel. That if you buy land, remember, when they entered Israel, the land had to be divided up according to the tribes. And subsequent to that, if you bought land, you could only keep it forever. What do you mean, only forever? Only forever. So the answer, yes, because forever is until the Yovel year. Every 50 years was the Yovel year, and then all land had to go back to its ancestral heritage. So in other words, we have precedent in Judaism that the word le'olam, which typically means forever until. What do you mean forever until? So it says like this: the ein oilim misham, the impurity and the personal connection to that impurity through the non-kosher food, the non-kosher relationships. Ein oilim misham, cannot be rescued, cannot be rehabilitated, cannot be elevated until. Okay, so you see it? La'olam, forever, until. Until what? Until the whole reality of life changes. Which is a fascinating thought. There's a le'olam, there is a forever, which means the reality as we know it. In this reality, there's no way out forever. Until we no longer live in this reality. What does that mean that we no longer live in this reality? We're not talking about until a person dies, God forbid, and then they're released. No, it's more profound than that. Ad ki yovoy yoimam. Those items are trapped in impurity until their day of reckoning arrives. At which time, and I quotes effectively the pasuk that says, "V'yevoyla hamovetz lo netzach." It's a prophecy from the book of Yeshaya that says, at that time, death will be swallowed up forever. Do you recognize that? We say it at a funeral. We say it at a shiva house, right? Bila hamaves. That's the actual pasuk. Bila hamaves lo netzach. Death will be swallowed up forever. So what's he telling us? Le'olam. The situation that a person lands in, or the situation that they generate in one area of their life. So the part of themselves that ate the non-kosher food, the part of themselves that engaged in the inappropriate relationship, as well as the actual food itself and the relationship itself, that is all absolutely trapped in impurity forever until the world as we know it completely shifts and death vanishes. Or Kamoisha Kos, like the pasuk says, Ve'es ruach hatuma a'avir min ha'aretz. When Hashem promises to remove the spirit of impurity from the world. Let's understand what's going on here. So effectively what we're describing is a person engages in a particular behavior that is outlawed by the Torah. It is completely off limits as far as the Torah is concerned. Therefore, because this behavior or this item is completely off limits in the Torah's reality, which is the reality of the world, therefore, if a person engages with it, it's a one-way valve, you can't get out. So let's say, for argument's sake, let's use something we could possibly relate to. Person is driving on a deserted road at night. There's not a street light. There's not a house. And the car breaks down on this deserted road in the dark. And they sit there. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. You say, you know what? You're never getting out of here. You're never getting out of here. Why? It's dark. You have no idea where you are. You have no idea where you're going. You have no idea where the closest place is. Nobody's driving past to help you. Your car is stuck. That's it. You're never getting out. Until what? Exactly. Until what? What's going to change? What's the one thing that will change?
Somebody comes first.
The one thing that will change is The morning comes. Once the morning comes, your entire reality changes, and guess what you discover? There's a help phone 5 meters down the road. One of those SOS phones. You had no clue. You had no idea that there was a way out, because the reality that you lived in at that time for those 6 hours or whatever it is, that reality was absolutely dark. And in that reality, there's no escape. Which means to say, if theoretically the sun would never come up again, the person would be stuck forever, in theory. Because there's nowhere to go. It's pitch black. You don't know what you're doing, right? Suddenly the sun comes up. The entire reality changes. Suddenly you see a way out. That wasn't possible. So in a similar vein, the world that we live in is a world that is dominated by impurity. We saw that in the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, he used an expression where he said, he said that the nature of our world is that everything in our world is difficult, and the evil people are the ones with the upper hand. That's how Hashem has designed our world. Our world is a world of darkness. And therefore it's a world of impurity. And in our world of darkness and impurity, if you get involved with darkness and impurity, there's no way out. It's the guy who, you hear these stories about the guy who didn't realize what he was given to take in the gift that he was asked to please give to a friend overseas. Right? And he arrives in the airport, and sure enough, the authorities have been tipped off, and he gets busted as a drug smuggler. Well, once you're in that world, that's it. You can't get out of it. There's no way out. No way out. I didn't know, I didn't realize, I hear. Yeah, we've seen it all before. Sorry, sir. You have your one phone call. Can't get out. Can't get out. So in the world of impurity, once you enter the world of impurity, you're in the world of impurity. That's it. So let's say the guy who crossed the gang leader, he did something. So now the gang leader says, you owe me. Now he's stuck. He's stuck for the rest of his life. He's doing errands for this gang leader and horrible things he doesn't want to do. Till one day what happens? The gang leader gets taken out and suddenly the gang falls apart, and what he thought was forever is no longer forever. So in the same way, the world that we live in is a world of darkness. It is a world of impurity. So therefore, if a person engages in an impure activity, they're stuck. But Hashem promises us that there is another world that we will live in. Call it the Messianic age. That's probably the best way to describe it. And the first definition of that reality is impurity gets removed from the equation. So now I'm free. I didn't turn it around. I haven't transformed it into something healthy. If it was kosher food and I ate the kosher food with the wrong intentions, afterwards I could turn the kosher food from being something that was unhealthy into something which is elevated and holy. The non-kosher food, I can't escape it. It is stuck. So what does Hashem do? He creates a new reality that will happen at some point in the future where the entire concept of impurity disappears. So the shackles of that bad behavior of my past disappears. It doesn't get elevated, doesn't get transformed, but at least it's gone. At least I'm no longer walking around with this ball and chain.
So that will only come
only when Mashiach comes. So le'olam, if a person makes a decision, God forbid, to do something which is inappropriate, they are stuck with it till Mashiach comes.
So even if you weren't from pride,
not from, not Jewish, not...
shellfish, that sticks with you.
That's it. That's it. Have you ever watched the Pinces? They chap you and that's it. They don't let you go. I would like to point out, though, that if a person converts to Judaism, it's a little different because prior to the conversion, there is no requirement to keep those laws. So therefore, there is no issue of transgression. There is still an issue of impurity. In other words, let's put it this way. Let's say that somebody was a smoker in the 60s, as was quite common. And that was a time where people were not necessarily aware of the effects, the health hazards of smoking. And then that information came out, whatever, in the 80s, became well known and documented how dangerous it is to smoke. So what's the person going to say? Listen, I wasn't, there were no rules in those days. There were no rules then that said you can't smoke in a car with other passengers, you can't smoke in a building, Now there's rules. You're right, so you didn't transgress. But your lungs are still messed up. Impurity is impurity. It doesn't matter where a person lived. Doesn't matter if the person was required or obligated or not. Either you were or you were not engaged with impurity. So that's it. The person's locked in until Mashiach comes. Oi. There's an alternative. What?
Can I ask, does Teshuvah not fit into this?
Hold your thought.
Oh, okay.
Oi. And this is not the oi with a yud at the end, which is spelled O-Y in English. This is the oi that means or. Oi, there's an alternative. There's another option. What's the option? Ad sheyase tshuva. Or you do teshuvah. Right? Phew! At this point, everybody breathes a collective sigh of relief. Thank God, Baruch Hashem, I thought I was a write-off and I was on parole until Mashiach comes, or I was maybe worse than parole until Mashiach comes. And that's it. Teshuvah, right? Everybody says, yay for Teshuvah. That's going to get us out of this. Says the Alter Rebbe, read the whole sentence. There's Teshuvah and there's Teshuvah. There's the kind of Teshuvah that a person bangs their chest and says, God, I'm really sorry for what I did. And then there's Teshuvah, right? Okay, interesting question. Somebody's asked in the chat if a convert's soul changes when they convert. It's a little bit more complicated than what we can afford to deal with in this shir right now. But the short answer is, it's not that the soul changes; it's that the soul that was embedded in them in a concealed fashion becomes revealed. Okay, so that's as much as we'll do on that topic for now. So what is Teshuvah? Listen to what he says. Teshuvah gedoyla. If a person doesn't want to wait for Mashiach, and a person wants to break the shackles of a particular behavior or choice that schlepped them all the way into darkness, then it's not just ordinary Teshuvah where you get up on Yom Kippur and say, I'll hate this and I'll hate that and I'll hate the next thing. But you need Teshuvah gedoyla. A great experience of teshuvah. In fact, it says gedoyla kol kach, a kind of teshuvah that is so radical. Shezdoinois nasuloi kezachyois mamash. It is a teshuvah that is so radical that it converts deliberate transgressions into credits. Okay, let's understand. So when it comes to classifying Averas, and it's something that unfortunately we do have to be aware of, there are classes of Averas. So we talk about what is called Chet and Pesha. There are various others, but let's talk about those two. Chet, like we say Al Chet on Yom Kippur, and Pesha, which we also mention on Yom Kippur, but much less so. The difference between the two is Chet is an action that was done B'shoigeg, inadvertently.
In what?
Inadvertently.
Okay.
Versus Pesha, which is a transgression that was done intentionally or rebelliously. So let's understand the difference.
Do we not get it wrong in that, for example, you will not let somebody, you will give aliyahs to people who don't keep Shabbos. They're not up there.
Right.
The 10.
Right.
But you'll give an aliyah to someone who maybe committed fraud a year ago, 2 years ago. Don't we have it wrong?
Okay, so you're asking an interesting question, which is not so much about what the objective standard is in terms of what's right, wrong, locked into impurity or not. You're asking a question in terms of the community's subjective standards that the community applies to people, which is wide open for debate, right? Who do you sanction and who do you allow? It's not so simple. So I feel that that's also a big conversation that a person has to have, and it may be at the discretion of the leadership of each community, but we have to acknowledge that it's a subjective standard that we're applying. So one community turns around and says, if you drive to shul, you may not be called up to the Torah on Shabbos, and another community says, if you married out of the faith, you can't be called to the Torah on Shabbos, or any time for that matter. And another view might well be that if a person is known publicly to have committed a fraud, that they shouldn't be called up to the Torah. And I think that these things are tricky and they need a lot of introspection, because once you start making judgment calls, where do you draw the line and on what basis? Probably the most significant basis would always be damage to the community. So the community should not honor somebody who's causing damage to the community.
As opposed to damage to themselves.
Correct. So damage to the community would include intermarriage, because that affects the sustainability of our community. Whereas breaking Shabbos is very much about the person's own spirituality. So we can draw that kind of distinction. So there are these two kinds of sins that people can do. As they say, sins of commission and sins of omission. But really what we mean over here is there's actually three ways that a person can transgress. The first way is what we call an oines. That means that the person wasn't even aware of what happened. So you wake up from your Shabbos shlof. Don't know if this has ever happened, because usually the daytime naps are the ones that you wake up more groggy, right? So a person wakes up from their Shabbos shlof in the afternoon, doesn't realize it's Shabbos. Doesn't realize that there's a light switch. They're completely oblivious to their actions. That's oinus. That's not even considered a sin. Shoigeg is where a person is unaware of the legal nature of what they're doing. So shoigeg means that the person thinks today's Tuesday and they flip the light switch. They know that you're not allowed to turn on a light on Shabbos. Not the groggy guy who doesn't even know what he's doing. They know that you're not allowed to turn on a light switch, but for whatever reason they think today's Tuesday. Or the person doesn't know that on Shabbos you're not allowed to turn on a light switch. Nobody ever taught them that. So that is called a shoigeg. And the nature of a shoigeg is that you cannot punish the person for having done whatever it is they did wrong, because it wasn't intentional. But whatever spiritual fallout may exist. So the guy who was smoking in the 60s was a shoigeg. He had no idea of the biological medical facts of smoking. So he's a shoigeg. You can't say, okay, now we're going to sue you because you gave second-degree smoke to your family. So we won't be able to prosecute him because he's a shoigeg, but he'll still suffer the consequences because it's real. Zodoin, or pesha, is where a person is absolutely aware of what they should not be doing, and they do it anyway. So that's the person who says, I don't care. It's outdated, it doesn't talk to me, I'm in a bad mood, whatever it is. So when a person has committed a zodoin, or a pesha, which means a wanton or deliberate transgression, regular teshuvah will downgrade it from a punishable offense to a shoigeg. That's what regular teshuvah achieves. So at the time I did it with malevolent intentions, but my teshuvah is effective enough that now my record shows that it was unintentional. So I'm not liable for any punishment, but I still have the smoke damage, effectively, the spiritual damage. So teshuvah gedola, higher grade teshuvah, is so powerful that it can take something that originally was a rebellious act, deliberately done against Hashem, and not downgrade it to an act that can't be punished, what the courts might call, mitigating circumstances in mitigation of prosecution, but would actually flip such a negative action to now be considered a credit. When a person does that level of teshuvah, then they break free of the darkness. Even though they're dealing with something which is asur, something which was completely bound to the world of impurity, which is quite a powerful thought, right? So we've got to now work out, how do you do that kind of teshuvah? That's what we'll do next time, please God. What's the secret of this kind of teshuvah? Because I'm pretty sure that every one of us wants to know, just please tell me how we do this, because we probably all have some areas in our lives that could do with this kind of teshuvah. So it'd be quite useful for us to know how to do it. That's what we'll talk about next time.